Welcome to the Big Séance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the Séance. Well, hello again. Come on in and join me for the Big Séance podcast. Does my voice sound a bit different tonight? If it does, well, it's because I'm freaking out. You may have heard me mention Elvis moments before, and tonight is definitely the biggest Elvis moment of them all so far. I have with me the Jim Harold. He's the most popular paranormal podcast host. Chances are you've listened to The Paranormal Podcast or maybe Jim Harold's Campfire. But he has several others as well. If it weren't for Jim Harold, you would not be listening to my voice today, because it was Jim that urged me to take his podcast course just this last spring. And so really he's my professor as well. If you go back further, without Jim, I probably would not have started BigSeance.com. If you go back even further, honestly, I wouldn't have founded my paranormal investigation team several years back, which kind of started this whole evolving journey. And that is why I'm freaking out. So how are you, Jim?
I'm doing well, and no need to be freaked out. I'm really complimented by the Elvis moment comment, and all I can say is thank you. Thank you very much.
An Elvis moment. It really is. It is an incredible honor to have you on, and I want to thank you so much for allowing me to let you talk to me on my very own podcast tonight.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak with you and with your audience, and really excited about what you've done and proud of what you've done, and, way to go. So I'm privileged to be a guest, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
No problem. Well, let's get started. Jim worked for nearly 20 years in various radio media positions in business development and management, including a role with CBS Radio, prior to launching his own company, Jim Harold Media, LLC, in 2010. A podcaster since 2005, Jim is America's most popular paranormal podcaster, and his focus is on a serious but fun look at the paranormal. Some listeners have said he's like Art Bell meets NPR. Jim's programs have been downloaded over 13 million times since 2010. He's regularly ranked among the top podcasts of their type on iTunes and have repeatedly been featured by Apple on their iTunes podcast front page. Jim's programs are also available via Roku, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher Radio, and via his website, jimharold.com. A published author, his book, Jim Harold's Campfire, was released by New Page Books and is available at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and in bookstores. In September 2013, Jim's second book, True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire 2, hit #1 bestseller in the supernatural category on the U.S. Kindle store and held that position for several weeks. Jim's latest book, True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire 3, was released on September 4th, 2014. I have to tell you, as a middle school teacher, I encourage my kids to be nerds at a talent or in multiple areas or hobbies. And growing up, what were some of the areas of nerdliness that you were involved in, even if it was outside of the paranormal?
Well, I was extremely nerdy when it came to, I was always interested in the news. I mean, I remember, I'm in my mid-40s, I remember watching Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it is. And probably like the only 8-year-old kid that I knew who watched Meet the Press. So I was, or some people say Meet the Depressed. But anyway, I always had an interest in broadcasting and news. My mom used to say I would walk around the house with a flashlight saying, "I'm Bob Barker." So broadcasting, it was like I was almost born with an innate curiosity for broadcasting. In later years, when I would go to college and take a history of broadcasting course, I look forward to it every day. I'm like, this is fascinating, and everybody else would be asleep. So I always loved broadcasting. And another area of nerdiness for me was, appropriately enough, the paranormal. And started out, I was reading, I remember as a kid reading books by Charles Berlitz on the Bermuda Triangle when that was a hot topic in the late to mid 70s, and In Search of with Leonard Nimoy, and later years Unsolved Mysteries. So really, those two categories were two main categories for my particular brand of nerdiness. And it all just kind of melded together quite a few decades later and turned out to make all this happen.
And you're really into the UFO part of the paranormal too, aren't you?
Yeah, it's one of those things that I've never kind of blocked myself off to any of it. I'm interested in kind of any and all aspects, because it's my belief that the universe is a far stranger place than we realize. Even those of us who are interested in this stuff, I think sometimes even if we knew what was really going on, our minds would be blown too, even though we kind of live with this stuff. And UFOs are included in that. But what I will say is, when I first started out, I always took a very siloed approach to all of this. Ghosts in one category, UFOs in one category, cryptozoology, some people to put that in the paranormal, some people don't, but that in a different silo. But now, and I've talked to some researchers who have been doing this a lot longer, been involved in this a lot longer than I have. And I think people are starting to look at the possibility that all of this is somehow connected. I just recently had Whitley Strieber on one of the programs, and he talked about alien visitation, although he doesn't say they're necessarily aliens. He calls them the visitors. He thinks that perhaps some of these things are somehow, these visitations are connected to death. I'm not sure what he meant by that, but what I am sure of is that I think that more and more people are thinking all of these things are connected. Now, that doesn't mean that I buy every flavor of the quote paranormal. For example, if you put cryptozoology in there, I'm pretty skeptical about Bigfoot claims. I'm not emphatically a skeptic that it can't be, but I just wonder if it is. But I think that there's enough interesting sightings and so forth to follow up on it and see if there's something to it. Other things like the afterlife, I absolutely believe in. Ghosts, I think there's something going on. UFOs, I think there's something going on, even if it's our military doing experiments. So I really enjoy exploring it all, even things that I don't necessarily believe in 100%.
You were one of the earliest podcasters, from what I've heard someone describe as the golden age of podcasting around 10 years ago. And when I listen back to a lot of old podcasts of yours and other people from, 2004, 2005, which I do occasionally because I'm a nerd, it really did sound like an exciting time, the start of a brand new media. How did you come to find podcasting in 2005, and what inspired you to start the Paranormal Podcast?
Well, I would say that actually right now we're in a golden age of podcasting, but it was an exciting time because it was something new. I'll start with my story. Basically, my story was this. I had gone to college for broadcasting and had every intent when I got out of school to work somewhere in front of a mic or in front of a camera. And like many people, I got my first job in broadcasting in the sales department. And I thought, well, they always tell you anywhere you can get call letters on your resume, take whatever job you can get and, move around from there. And the particular station I worked at was in a major market, but it was a smaller station and it was family owned and it was very familial. And the salespeople got to do a lot of different things like write copy. Heck, sometimes they'd even do voiceovers. I'm like, oh, this is not so bad. And these sales guys make like 4 times or 3 times what the rest of the staff makes. So maybe I'll give this a try for a while. Well, for a while turned into 12 or 13 years. Not only with that radio station, but subsequent radio stations. I worked for a newspaper. I was the original job hopper. I had a lot of a lot of jobs, but almost all of them, I think, except for one, somehow involved in the media, selling advertising and so forth, and learned a ton. And I think in later years, that has helped me immensely as I've launched my own company. But I was locked in, and it was 2005, and that's where I was at. I was, in my mid-30s, had a wife, 2 kids, and pretty much any hope I had of becoming a broadcaster was gone because, where could I get a job? I'd really like to do this, and I was good 12 or 13 years ago in school. Give me a shot. I don't think so. Not unless I was willing to go to a teeny tiny town and make $3 an hour. And that wasn't an option with my spouse and 2 children. Mm-hmm. So let's put that part of it aside. The other part of it is I was always a talk radio fan. And I was always a fan of a gentleman by the name of Leo Laporte. Mm-hmm. If you're familiar with him, a tech journalist who was on cable television for a long time with a dedicated tech station. It was called ZDTV, and it was called Tech TV. And I always enjoyed Leo's shows, and also a fan of talk radio. And I have been someone who had listened to streaming audio on the internet since the dial-up days. And the first station I worked for was actually a pioneer in streaming media over the internet, one of the first stations to do so. So I always thought that was cool, and I'd always look up different things. And even before you could Google something, I would look up streaming things. I thought, that Leo Laporte guy, he's not on TV anymore. I wonder if you could stream his radio show. So I went to his website, and you could stream his radio show, but he also had these new things, brand new, called podcasts. And I'm like, well, what in the world is a podcast? And at the time, podcasts, when this happened, weren't even on iTunes yet.
Yeah.
But I figured out there was a program, I think it was called Juice, and you could download automatically. And there were 2 podcasts I listened to. I listened to his Tech Guy podcasts, and I listened to a podcast. It was called Daily Source Code, and it was by a guy by the name of Adam Curry, if you remember him from MTV. Mm-hmm. And he started to podcast, and actually, I guess you could say he almost co-invented it with a guy by the name of Dave Weiner. So anyway, I started listening to these guys' podcasts, and it was really cool because I was in the sales job. So I didn't even have an iPod. I had like this clunky old Arcos MP3 player that was like a brick, and it held a whopping 5 gigabytes. It was, and so anyway, I started loading these things on, and I'd be going out to a sales call. Instead of listening to the radio, I'd put in my little cassette adapter and listen to these. And I was like a pioneer. And then I found out, well, it wasn't just big names like Adam Curry and Leo Laporte doing this, but people were doing this on a homegrown level. They were doing it out of their basements and out of their dens. And I was always one to dabble in technology. I build I don't anymore because I've gone to Mac, but I used to build my own computers and different things. Talk about nerdy. And I was always interested in tech. So I heard that people were making these at home. And it's like, I really miss broadcasting. I'm never going to be a professional broadcaster. That ship has sailed. But I could do a little show, and it would be kind of fun. Maybe 20 or 30 people would listen. So the next step was, and this will answer your question eventually, was, well, what in the world am I going to do a podcast on? And I thought about the different things that I'm interested in life: sports, politics, music. Music you still can't do pretty much unless you don't want to play any music because of licensing issues. Mm-hmm. And I wish somebody would figure that out because I've got a great idea for a music podcast I'd love to do. But anyhow, I thought, well, what is something that's missing out there in terms of podcasts? There's political podcasts. There's, I don't think I can add anything in there. And I said, well, I've always been fascinated by the paranormal, but I don't necessarily like the way that I see the paranormal treated on television and things. I think it's a little trivial. What if I did an interview show where I just sit down as a layperson and talk to people like Stanton Friedman and Brad Steiger and people like that about their books, about their opinions. And at the time I thought, Patrick, the best thing about this was going to be I would be able to do this podcast for maybe 6 months, and I would have all this paranormal stuff figured out. Well, guess what? 9 years later, I have more questions than I had back then. I think I thought I knew more back then than I know now, if that makes any sense. That's how I got started in it. And for the first 2 or 3 years I did the shows, I kind of dabbled. I'd do a show, and then I would do another show for 2 months. And then I'd do another show, and I would do another show for 6 months. And I remember distinctly in 2008, 3 years after I started the show, and I had started another media job, and it was one of those jobs where you thought was going to be the greatest job in the world. And I got in, and it was a nice place to work. But I said, this stuff is not going to be my career. And I was listening, and I'll never forget this, that morning I was listening to Dan Carlin, a guy who does a tremendous history podcast, hardcore history, one of the best podcasts you'll ever hear in terms of production and so forth. I think my shows are pretty good. His are the best in terms of just production quality. It's NPR quality. It's fantastic. And I was listening to him, and he's got sponsors and things. And it's like, well, people are emailing me, asking me for episodes of this show. I'm going to work every day. I'm beating my head against the wall. Yet I've got these people over here asking me for content. Why don't I get serious for 6 months and see what happens? Within 6 months, I had my first sponsor after producing on a regular weekly basis. And then it just kind of took off from there. I added the Campfire show in 2009. I added the Paranormal Report about a year and a half later. That's my video podcast. And it just became evident to me that this was my calling. This is what I was supposed to do. So thank God for podcasting and for my audience.
And what's really cool is you really rode, you have been on this paranormal craze wave really for the whole time. The timing just kind of worked out perfectly. And I don't know, maybe you even created the, paranormal craze or had a part of that. So, the paranormal has changed a lot since 2005.
Oh, I think it has. I can even tell a difference talking to people, telling people back in 2005, I do this little internet radio show. Essentially, that's what a podcast is. An internet radio show you can listen to when you want and where you want. Mm-hmm. And it's on the paranormal, and they kind of look at me weird. And now a lot of people are like, oh, I love that stuff. Or, yeah, this happened to my aunt. Or well, I don't believe in this stuff, but there was this one time. So people's attitudes have changed both about the paranormal and about podcasting. For the longest time, 90% of the people I would mention podcast to would say, what's a podcast? And now it's almost the opposite, because I assume people aren't going to know what it is. So I say, well, I do a podcast. It's kind of like it's like, I know what a podcast is. So it's really great. And I think, there was a time, I don't know, it might've been 2008, 2009. And by the way, I never believed this, but people said podcasting is dead.
Yeah.
And I never believed that, because my audience always grew. It just wasn't this exponential growth that people want to see. People want to see things. It's kind of like the stock market syndrome. You want to buy a company, you want to see it quadruple its growth in like 3 years. Mm-hmm. And I just always felt that it was going to grow, and it was going to grow, and it was going to continue to grow. And there are a couple things that have been really important to that. One is, some people might accuse me of being an Apple fanboy, but Apple has done more to promote the podcast than any organization on earth by making it a part of iTunes. Mm-hmm. Then there's some great independent podcasters out there, but I think you have people like Adam Carolla kind of getting involved. And I think that's helped immensely. And people like Mark Maron, the comedian, who did have, is better known now, but also had a radio show previous to his podcast and had been known on the stand-up circuit. And certainly podcasting has transformed his career. And then perhaps the biggest development of all, anybody out there who utilized podcasts in the early days knows what a pain it was. You had to hook up your device, whether it was an iPod or whatever it was, and sync it to your computer, and back and forth you go. And now you can just either stream or download directly from your smartphone. So smartphones have been huge. And in fact, a company like, and I believe on iOS 8 that just came out today, as we record this, I believe that the podcast app, I'm not sure about this, but the podcast app is actually on the device.
That's what
automatically.
I hear. Yeah.
And to me, just having that button that says podcasts on it is just huge. It's like getting station on cable TV or whatever the corollary might be. So now there's so many different ways to listen. I mean, I can tell you, Patrick, and I know you know this, but just for your audience benefit, I could think about 7 or 8 different ways people can listen to my shows now. And they can listen on my websites. They can listen on iTunes. They can listen on TuneIn Radio. They can listen on Stitcher Radio. They can listen on my Roku channel that I have. They can listen or watch on Apple TV. And there are probably quite a few that and plus there are a ton of podcatching software apps out there, whether they be for phones or computers or whatever. So there's multiple ways. So it used to be one way people could listen. Now there's so many different ways they can access the content.
And people probably listening to you on devices and from directories that you've never even heard of.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So several of my favorite authors and personalities have been guests on your podcasts multiple times, and I may or may not have, stolen a few of those as well. But have you gained lasting friendships out of any of your guests over the years?
Oh, no question. No question. It's kind of like my social outlet. I know more people online than I do off, certainly. And over time, yeah, you do build relationships. I'm not going to say who this was, but there was one author who I had on the first time, and I don't think I've ever told this in public. And I thought, oh, that person's just full of themselves. But for whatever reason, I asked this person back on. I don't know what I was smoking that time, but not a nicer person in the world. One of the nicest, most down-to-earth people who has been on the show multiple times now. And I would call that person a friend. So the thing is I have met and been able to chat about these things. It's just so cool because in a way, having a podcast kind of gave me a chance to be a fly on the wall in this community. I think it was my second show. I contacted Stanton Friedman, and that's back when people say, well, I'll be on whatever this is, but what is a podcast? But anyway, if anybody's familiar, Stanton Friedman is probably one of the biggest all-time names in ufology. He's basically the guy that wrote the Betty and Barney Hill story, or made it public through his book, and has been very active for the last 30, 40 years. And if you don't know the name, if you saw his picture and you've at all seen anything on UFOs, you'll say, that guy. And he's a physicist and just a brilliant guy. Now, back in 2005, if I would have emailed him and said, I'm this guy and I'm really interested in this UFO stuff and don't know what quite going on, but I'd like to talk to you about 30 or 40 minutes and just get your general thoughts. My chances are that wouldn't have happened. But having a podcast, and I try to tell this to people, whatever your field of endeavor, and I think this goes beyond the paranormal, I think this can be applied in many different ways, is if you want to get access to a community or to a group of thought leaders, it's a great way to do it. And it's a great way to network. And, when I started, nobody knew me in the paranormal community. And now most of the big authors do know at least the name. I haven't been able to get everybody on. I've tried to get Eric Von Daniken on. Haven't had success yet, but I'm going to go see him at the Paradigm Symposium in a few days here. And maybe I can buttonhole him and just say, hey, could you let me interview you? But for the most part, it's been great. I just had Whitley Strieber on, as I mentioned. Ian Punnett's been on the show. We get similar caliber, I think, of guests. The top show that does any of this, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, that they are the king. They're like the Tonight Show of this genre, is Coast to Coast AM. Mm-hmm. But I feel that particularly over the last several months, I think our guests are right up there with a Coast to Coast.
So I promise you I want to talk a lot about the book coming out, but I can't ask this next question without revealing once again how big of a nerd I am. The theme music to the Paranormal Podcast, which you've had forever, has always pumped me up and gotten me excited for a dose of the paranormal, and it's become rather nostalgic for me, and it takes me back to, my drives in the car and, walks through the neighborhood at night and the times that I went through all your archives. And I remember in a very early episode, you mentioned the person who put that theme together for you. Can you tell us a little about how that theme music came about, or any of your themes for that matter?
As I recall it, there was this site. It was called PodSafe Music because, as I mentioned before, there are all these restrictions on what music you can use. You know, you can't take the latest YouTube record and play it on a podcast, or you risk being sued because of BMI and ASCAP. But when podcasting first started, there was a site where you could download music by independent artists and use them in their in your programs. So I found this one, and the gentleman's name is Devin Anderson. And frankly, I haven't talked to Devin in years. I should email him. But always a very nice guy. He actually sent me, I think, an alternate version, which I got so wedded to the first version that I've never stopped. But he's the one that created that, and that's the site that I found him on. And it's just, it strikes a mood. And I've toyed over the years with changing it just to do something fresh. But it's like, you know, you just, something is that, well, I wouldn't say iconic, but something that's identified, something that's that identified with a program. I just don't think you change it. Subsequent shows, I did a lot of stock music. Just went out and purchased what they call royalty-free music that you can utilize for productions like a podcast. Particularly, I think the Campfire music is great. I love that music for that. It almost strikes, I think, the perfect mood to tell some spooky stories. So I really tip of the cap to Devin for his fine work. And the thing is that, you know, when you and you know this, when you put together a podcast, particularly if you're doing it by yourself, you've got to be a little bit of everything. So you've got to find resources that can help you with that. You know, I'm not a music composer, so I couldn't do music, so I had to find music somewhere. I'm not an artist, so I have to find resources to create art for me. And if you're independent content producer and a podcaster specifically, you have to have all those things. So you almost have to build a virtual team. Now, those can be one-offs. You know, you can utilize different resources for different things, but there's no way you can do it alone without pulling in other resources, because very few people can compose and record a song and make album art and do the tech side of it and do the broadcasting. So you've almost got to create a little team. Even if it's somebody you use just for one project, you temporarily make them a part of your team.
When we return from this brief break, we'll talk to Jim Harold about his Campfire podcast and talk more about the book, True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire 3, which was just released. So we'll catch you on the other side of this break.
You're listening to the Big Séance podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
National Podcast Day is coming September 30th. But what is National Podcast Day? Well, it's pretty simple, and you can help spread the word. National Podcast Day is dedicated to promoting podcasting worldwide through public engagement. You may be asking, what can I do to get involved on National Podcast Day? It's easy. Head over to nationalpodcastday.com and check the suggestions. But ultimately, the options are endless. Remember, September 30th, nationalpodcastday.com.
So I would first of all like to apologize for sounding a little bit like Rudolph tonight. My allergies have decided to kick in full swing today, but I did want to break in and tell you how much I enjoyed that interview with Jim Harold. It has been such an amazing experience just to be able to talk to him on the podcast, and it means a lot to me. So Jim, if you're listening, thank you again. I appreciate it. But I did want to make a quick note and announcement. It had been a while since I had checked out topparanormalsites.com. It had been a couple months, and I just checked that out and noticed that there are like 4 or 5 additional comments, really nice comments from people on Top Paranormal Sites. So if that is you, and you know, I can't always tell who has written those things, so I can't personally thank you, but I do see those comments, and I very much appreciate it. If you'd like to go to topparanormalsites.com, you can rate and review, and you can also see a whole bunch of other top paranormal sites that are out there. Right now, it looks like my site is cruising along at number 25, and that's where I've been lately. Sometimes it's around 20 to 25. I also want to ask once again that you cruise on over to iTunes, if iTunes is something you use, and please consider giving me a rating or a comment over there on iTunes as well, because that really helps. My announcement is that next week I will have a really, really great episode, and I'm not just saying that because at the end of this interview, I just felt so good about it and had such a warm, fuzzy feeling. I had an interview with Sarah Wiseman, who is the author of several books, but I read her book, Writing the Divine, several years ago and was really moved by that, and I reached out to her to get an interview, and it was really, really a nice one. And so I think you'll enjoy it. That is next week right here on the Big Seance podcast. Now let's get back to the interview with Jim Harold.
Thanks for joining us for the Big Seance podcast. We'd better get back to the table while there's still some candlelight left.
I want people to know by the time this airs, you will have just recently been on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie again for another appearance talking about your book. So they can go back and check that out if they want to hear that. But why don't you go ahead and give us kind of a sneak peek at True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire 3.
Well, this is thus the name, the third book in the series. And essentially what it is the way I do these books is I take a certain amount of shows, maybe 50 to 60 shows, something like that. And I go through them and I look at all the stories. And then I say, okay, what are the best stories of the group? And I compile these books. They're typically 70 stories. And they are stories that are told by our audience on my Campfire program. Now, the Campfire program is a little bit different. My Paranormal podcast is where I interview people like Whitley Strieber, or Ian Punnett, or Brad Steiger, or Stanton Friedman, people like that, about their theories, their books, and so forth. Campfire is just normal folks, just people who are listeners and who have had something strange happen to them. And a few years ago, after I started, a couple of years, a friend of mine said, hey, you ought to make a book out of that. And I said, I never thought of that. So what we did is we compiled the stories and lightly edit them. So they flow, but I try not to change in any way the meaning or what happened or embellish it. So if you read something in one of the books, this is what the person said happened. It's not something that Jim threw in because he thought it was spooky. So these 70 stories are 70 true life stories that have happened to people. For example, in this one, we've got several different parts. We've got part 1 is hauntings and ghost stories. And then we have a section called Ouija stories. Part 3 is monsters and shadow people. And part 4 is visions, dreams, and messages from beyond. And part 5, for things that are hard to categorize and just plain strange, it's just called bizarre. And those are the sections of the books. And some of the stories are very elaborate, multiple pages. The first story in the book is one of my favorites. And that one is very involved and takes us across the country. And then some of the stories will just be a simple page of something that happened that was very poignant or very spooky or whatever the case may be. So that's what the book is, a compilation of true stories from our program. This is the third in the series, and the thing that I like about this book and the last book is that I can make it very affordable for people. If you utilize Kindle, you can get the books 2 or 3 for $2.99 a piece, and you don't have to have a Kindle to get a Kindle book. They have a ton of free apps you can use for phones, you can use for your computer. So if you're listening to this podcast, you can read a Kindle book. Or if you prefer the traditional Dead Tree version, you can get those as well for, more of a hardcover, or not hardcover, but a hard copy price. But electronically, they're just $2.99. So I think I figured that out. That's less than a nickel a story. So, and I love that. And those are published through my company. And I do that because I can, Campfire 2 and Campfire 3. I was traditionally published on Campfire 1, which is still available, and I encourage people to check that out too. But Campfire 2 and Campfire 3, I control the pricing. I control, how it's marketed and things. So I want to make it very affordable and accessible for people.
There's a campfire moment that has always remained with me from several years ago. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was in the first Campfire book as well. But it's where a gentleman claimed that him and his wife went to see a movie at a theater.
I know what it is.
And experienced was it a time slip? Is that how he referred to it?
Yeah, it was actually, the movie was Hellboy.
Uh-huh.
And basically they had gone to the movie theater, and he had been dealing with a lot of health problems. And essentially what happens is they ended up going to the movie theater, but then they walked in after they got the popcorn and things, and by their calculation, they should have been early. And something was playing on the screen. They said, oh, it's the previews. And after they were there a while, they realized that it was the end of the movie. and they were kind of like, well, what's going on here? So the end of the movie plays, and they asked one of the ushers. He said, what's wrong? This, and I don't have it in front of me, but this was supposed to, something to the effect, this was supposed to start at 4:00. And we just walked in, and he said, well, it's 6:00. And they said, well, we must have gotten the wrong screen. What other theaters is this playing in within the complex? He said, this is the only screen. And this was the man and his wife. So it wasn't one person. It was two people who experienced walking into the theater, looking at their watch. It's one time. They get in the theater. It's 2 hours later. Magically. They walked out of the theater, and they could tell, they thought maybe, somebody's playing a trick on or something. The sun's position had changed. You know how the sun will change over a period of time.
Uh-huh.
And they could tell that it was a couple hours later. Never was able to figure out what caused that. Now, last time I spoke with him, and it's been a while, but he said that his health challenge has subsided and all is well now. But he says that is an experience he'll never forget.
And I remember thinking, wow, I believe that completely.
Well, two things. That's one of the stories people ask me about the most. It's amazing how many people mention that story. Second of all, that's kind of the touchstone of these stories. I try to select things that are things that I believe. Not that I don't believe most of my callers. I do believe most of them. And I believe almost all of them believe they have experienced something supernatural. Is it possible that it's not? Yes, it's possible. But I look for, particularly for these books, when I kind of select the best stories, I try to get the ones that come across with the most sincerity and the most emotion. And I think you can hear that when you listen to the callers. I mean, I've had many people say, my goodness, this happened to me 25 years ago, and I'm getting goosebumps as I tell you about it. Or people who say, I never told this story to anybody until I've shared it with your audience. Never told my family. And that to me is quite an honor. When I started this show, I have to be honest, I never thought it would be more than something that was just entertaining. And again, in the world of podcasts, it's pretty big size, relatively speaking. But compared to something like Coast to Coast, it's tiny. But I will say this, for the people that listen, I think that for some of them, it's more than a podcast, more than just something that's cool to listen to, which I hope it is. But I think it's also kind of cathartic. Mm-hmm. And I don't claim to be any kind of therapist or anything like this, but it's like a paranormal support group for the air, because what it does is I think people say, oh, that person experienced that. I thought I was the only one. I thought I was crazy. Mm-hmm. So I think that in some ways it's the most important show that I do.
You must be really intuitive, because Melissa, a fan of yours, sent in this question. She said, have you ever had a campfire caller tell a story that you absolutely, without doubt, thought was totally made up? And if so, did you still include it?
I don't really, and maybe I'm just gullible. I only think there's been one or two calls the whole time I've done this that I've ever censored. I tend not to censor them. If I have a story that I think is maybe weaker, I may spread them out amongst podcasts. I do kind of, I kind of compare compiling the show so people know how I produce it, like a railroad car, like a model railroad train. Mm-hmm. And I have this kind of rolling stock. I have these shelves with these different box cars on it. and I select and I put them together that way. But after I finish answering your question, I'll tell you about something that interesting that does happen is not planned a lot of times. I say this on the air, and it really is interesting to me, kind of weird. But for the most part, no. For the most part, I think people are leveling with me. Maybe there are people. There's been a couple times, but not much at all. But the thing that I was going to tell you, you know how I said I assembled the show? It's kind of like I have 15 stories on my shelf. And okay, well, this is a black-eyed kid story, and this one was a little weaker, so we'll put this one in, but there's another one's a little weaker. We're not going to put two weaker stories in the same show. I do some of that. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times what will happen is that basically I put the form up, somebody signs up, and that week, I tend to look at the things, I hate to say it, 5-10 minutes before I'm ready to do the calls. That way I'm busy, plus that way I have it at the forefront of my mind. And I'll tell you how many times people will call or sign up for a particular date where they'll have very kind of overlapping or similar stories. Like I had 1 week, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had 3 people call in with college ghost stories. And they called in on the same night, and I wasn't even asking for those stories. And I can't tell you how many times that's happened, and I'll reference it on the show. Or there'll be things that are somehow connected or similar. And it's just always funny. And and sometimes, like college ghost stories, I could go 6 months and not have a college ghost story. And I had something like 3 in one night. So sometimes I wonder, is there something else at play here?
The stars are lining up for Jim Harold's Campfire.
Yeah, indeed. And I really do. I mean, for people to tell their stories and share their stories in public, for me or increasingly, I'm sure for you, talking on the mic is not, a big deal. But these are people who maybe have never been on the radio, have never been comfortable with sharing these stories. So I always try to keep in mind how much they're trusting me to be fair with them and to be kind to them. Mm-hmm. And even if it's something, I've had people who said that they saw robots in their house or little robots, one gentleman said. And I mean, most people would say, oh, that's pretty far-fetched. But I didn't take it that way. He said he saw what he saw. Weird things have happened to me too. So I just kind of say, tell us what happened. What do you think that could be? I may even say, do you think you might have been hallucinating or something? And I just let them tell their story as they experience. Because as I said originally, I think this world is much stranger than we give it credit for. And maybe even the most far-fetched stories, maybe there's something to them.
Yeah, and I have to agree with what you said also about, it kind of being maybe therapeutic for people to talk about those things. I will still sometimes get, I have a somewhat inactive paranormal group, but I'll still get an email from someone I don't know, either requesting help or just needing information or telling me about some activity going on in their home or whatever. And a lot of times, they'll have this huge email telling me of the experiences they're going through. And, I'll reply and I'll either ask more questions or give them some information or try to give them, links to where they can find out more. And a lot of times I won't hear from them after that. And I've really started thinking, I think they just needed to get it out. They needed to tell someone who they know is not going to, just instantly make fun of them.
Right.
It's probably the same kind of thing.
I think it's very much what you're saying is that people sometimes just need a friendly ear, and someone will say, that's an interesting experience. And what do you think was behind it? Just talk to them about it. And that's why I think people come on the show, because they know I'm not going to be judgmental. Mm-hmm. And even if their story is, what some people might consider far out, to use a really antiquated term, groovy. Someone who will accept it on its face and just say thank you for sharing.
Well, speaking of Campfire, I know you've got to go and work on some Campfire stories, but why don't you tell us what's coming up at jimharold.com and maybe jimharold.net and, give your contact information and mention also your podcasting class, because that is why I'm here.
Well, can I do one thing first? Could I share a campfire story with you before we go?
Please do.
Well, this is one's a little elaborate, but I'll try to encapsulate a little bit. This is the first book in the first story in the third book, the new book. It's called Something Really Nasty. And it began about a dozen years ago. And this woman went to visit a friend of hers who lived in Richmond, Virginia. She lived in North Carolina. And she was going to stay the weekend. I'm not quite sure if it was a romantic relationship or not. Kind of get the sense it might have been. But nevertheless, she went to her friend's house, and he said, "Oh, I'm checking on my parents' house. Would you mind to go with me?" They were out of town. So they start to drive over there, and all of a sudden, as he's approaching, he started to get very tense. And he said, "You know how I told you this house was haunted one time?" And she said, "Yeah, I kind of remember that. Well, I shouldn't bring you here. I should take you back home." And he really got freaked out about it. And she said, No, don't worry about it a bit. Don't worry about it a bit. So they go in. I won't go into detail, but there's all of these crazy events. She sees a figure in the hallway, the foyer, as they're standing there. And all of these crazy things happening where they feel like they're going to fall down. They feel a presence. They try to get out. As they walk out the door slams shut and locks itself. Literally blows her out into the front yard from the porch. Very spooky story, if that was the only story that happened. But it's just the beginning. So anyway, they spend the rest of the weekend together, but they just can't shake this weird feeling like they're being watched. So anyway, she goes back home to North Carolina, and over the course of a while, some years, they lose touch, kind of have a little falling out, and she goes to move out west, and she lives out in Albuquerque. She has a home where weird stuff starts happening. And then one evening, she has a son, and they go trick-or-treating. And they go through these different shops. There's this one particular area she talks about in Albuquerque where there are all these cool little shops. And one of them is kind of a new age bookstore. And she lets her son lead the way, and he walks in. And as they're walking in, the gentleman behind the counter looks up at her and looks at her kind of unusually. And he goes ahead and talks to the little boy and gives him some candy. And he looks back up at this woman, the mom, and said, "Would you mind if I talk to you for a minute?" And she says, "Fine." He said, "I think my boss would like to talk to you." And she says, "Okay." And he's like, "What in the world's this all about?" So this kind of mysterious woman comes through these beaded curtains and says, "You probably wonder why my associate here wanted me to talk to you. You have a beautiful, beautiful aura. Absolutely beautiful. But there's something really nasty clinging to you." And she said, "Okay." She said, "Would you mind if I try to perform a cleansing?" And so this woman performs a cleansing, and this woman at some point, our kind of protagonist here, she kind of sensed, she thinks there's going to be a pitch for money, and the woman looks at her and said, "Honey, I would never charge you money for this. I just want to try to get whatever this is to go away from you. And I don't know if this will do it. Come back anytime you want, and we'll try to keep working on it." So anyway, some time passes. Things seem to normalize. And she reunites with her friend. And they're both visiting Raleigh, North Carolina. So they get together. And they talk about that night in question, the strange night at his parents' house. And she jokes and she says, I think I picked up something there. Tells him about all these things. So I hope it piggybacks on you and goes back to where it came from. And they have a little joke and they part ways. After she gets home, she gets a phone call from him. Frantic. And he said, "You're not going to believe what happened." He said, "Remember that remark you made about the whatever it was coming back with me?" Well, he said, "When I got home that particular weekend, that Sunday, I went to have lunch with my parents, as I always do on Sundays. And I came back home. The minute I got home, my phone was ringing. So I hurried up and I opened my door and I went, it was my mom. And she said, 'It's back.' Essentially, what had happened is that after they had this strange event all those years before, this house that had been extremely haunted with strange things happening all the time, all activity ceased. Until this creature, this entity, whatever it was, piggybacked back upon this man, went across the country, and went back home. And by the way, she's never had any more activity after that. So I thought that would be a good campfire story to kind of whet people's appetite.
And that makes me really excited to, because I haven't read the third book yet, but I do plan on it, and I'll be getting one of those dead tree versions. That's what I prefer. That's a nice story.
Yeah, that's a great story. I thought it was a great one to start the book off with. Well, to answer your question before, how can folks connect to everything that I do? I will briefly mention the podcasting class. It's a self-paced, self-taught class. It's a video course. There's probably several hours of video content there, and I take you step by step on how to create a podcast. And if you can master it half as well as Patrick has, you'll be well on your way. He's done a fantastic job. I'm very proud of him. And it's at podcastwithjim.com. It's podcastwithjim.com. It is a paid course, but I think it's a very reasonable price for it. It's not that expensive at all. So check it out at podcastwithjim.com if you want to start podcasting yourself, which I certainly think everybody should have a podcast. For my podcast, and I always put people in the direction of my free podcasts at jimharold.com. My name's JIMHAROLD.com. And you can find their free editions of my paranormal podcast program, the Campfire program, and also the Paranormal Report. That is a video podcast I do with Micah Hanks. And those are free the last 90 days. So anybody new, I say, get the free stuff for goodness sake. And then if you really love it, there are some paid podcasts, but go through the free archive first. And then for the books, I would certainly think people should pick those up. You can find this book and links to the other books at jimharoldbooks.com. That's jimharoldbooks.com, JIMHAROLD books.com. And that'll actually take you to the Amazon page for the latest book. And again, Campfire 2 and Campfire 3 are available in electronic version for only $2.99 a piece. So at least to my mind, it's a real bargain.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for being such a really awesome influence in my life and for coming on my little podcast. I appreciate it.
Well, it may be a little podcast today, but you keep doing what you're doing. It's going to grow. It's growing already. I see on New and Noteworthy on iTunes, you're doing a great job. And I'm going to have to watch out. I've got some competition. Thank you so much, Patrick. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. You rock. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com, now the home of both the blog and the podcast. Just click on the Big Seance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Do you have any comments or feedback? Please contact me at patrick@bigseance.com. You can call my feedback line at 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. You can also record audio feedback right from the site using the SpeakPipe link included in the show notes. I could decide to include your voice in a future show. Thank you so much for listening and reading. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.